Can you hear me?
Hey, Joey, how you doing?
Good. How's it going?
Going pretty good. I know I started a little bit early, but this is the first time I've actually done like a live sort of thing.
Yeah, I haven't been on live in a long time either.
Nah. So I like about an hour or so before we were supposed to do this. I realized I got your email, and so I've been reading through your document and sort of on the spot preparing. So I feel like I'm prepared.
Okay. Yeah, the document's very long. It goes, but I tried to because there's so many different avenues that this conversation kind of takes. You have people saying, oh, the Bible does condone it. And then you have Christians on one side of that saying that it doesn't. And then you have Christians on the other side saying, well, the Bible says it's okay. So that means it's okay if whatever God says goes. So there's a lot of different room to cover that I tried to cover in that space.
Yeah. I mean, I think you've taken up a pretty, at least a more tenable position than a lot of people out there. So, I'm here for the debate that we're supposed to have. Which, like I said, I'm learning how to do all of this right now. I'm trying to see if I can maybe change the orientation to where we're both on the screen. I don't know. Like I said, I'm new at this. Yeah, hey there, Jane, in the comments. I see it. Oh, Casey's here. Hi, honey. Thank you.
I know. I can turn my camera on.
Okay.
Camera.
There you are.
We're halfway there. This works too, honestly.
Okay. Well, I just I don't know. I'm very used to YouTube, and so with YouTube, there's a little bit. I don't know. I feel like for me, it's a little bit more flexible, but I'm still trying to figure out all the ins and outs of the live kind of thing. Oh, yeah, somebody said Jag in the comments said Bible guy raid. Thank you so much, Bible guy. Yeah, I'm trying to. I don't know. I'm trying to figure this out. I don't know how you want to progress with the discussion or debate. Did you want to do more of we
could kind of start off if you want to just kind of talk about where you're coming from, because I know you think that the Bible, it says up there, condones slavery. So we could definitely talk about that, why what in the Bible indicates too that it condones slavery.
Yeah. Well, I mean, why don't you? I mean, I'm obviously taking the positive position on this, so I don't know if I need to go first or if you need to go first. I'm not sure how that all debate things.
Typically, you would go first, but if you want, I can kind of go over my take on it.
Okay, yeah, sure. If you want to go ahead and go, over your take on it, that would be great, and then I can fumble my way around figuring all this shit out.
Yeah. So pretty much my take on it is that, because a lot of the verses, there's a list of verses in the Bible that a lot of atheists and many people will point to and say, oh yeah, these verses say that slavery is okay, or this is the Bible condoning slavery. And to me, a lot of these verses, when you look at them in their full context, isn't necessarily the Bible saying slavery is okay, as much as for example, in the epistles, when Peter or the other apostles say, slaves be obedient to your masters, it's not really them saying slavery is okay, as much as saying okay, well, this is the system in place. This is kind of what you need to follow, if that makes sense, for your own safety. And I think even in the Old Testament, when you look at, the laws, I don't think these laws are necessarily there setting a social system. I think they're trying to kind of tell people how to live within the system that's already there. And a lot of scholars John Walton, Michael Heiser, they kind of go over this kind of thing too. But that's kind of the premise of what I'm talking about.
Okay, yeah, I know in your document, you kind of went over an argument for, what did you call it? Moral...
the moral concession.
Moral concession, that's what it's called. Yeah. Do you kind of want to go just so that the everybody is sort of up to speed on it? Do you want to tell everybody what that is?
So I think moral concession, obviously, when you hear that and you're talking about God, it can be kind of like, okay, well, God's making moral concession. It's not necessarily that as much as it is like God is looking at what's going on and he's picking, like throughout the Bible, it's progressive morality. So God isn't necessarily coming to these people and saying, okay, you need to be how I want you now. They're trying, he's like kind of taking steps. So, and I think we would agree, like throughout history, humans have become more moral. And I think that this is kind of just a different side of that.
Okay. All right. So obviously I'm going to come at this from, I feel like it's a pretty good position. I mean, I've ran my position past Dr. Joshua Bowen. I know that you've talked to Dr. Josh before as well. Basically, my position is that it's pretty plainly laid out in the Bible that God condones slavery. Primarily because like verses like Leviticus 25, 44 through 46. That particular section where it lays out, God, basically saying, hey, you can, procure slaves from the nations around you, and then, you can pass them down as inherited property. They are yours and all that kind of stuff. And then there's also the several laws in the Old Testament that plainly lay out different rules for owning slaves, treating slaves, and this, is similar to slave laws in the greater or the ancient Near East, in the same area, and in other cultures. And in some respects, the Israelite form of slavery, their rules for it were a bit more harsh than their surrounding counterparts. So it seems to me like if God really didn't condone slavery, then he would have flat out said, don't own people as slaves.
Yeah, I mean, I could see why you might say that, but at the same time, I think it goes back to like, this isn't God trying to create a new social system as much as it's trying to help them live within the system that's there. So like what you're saying about, all these passages that specifically tell you like certain, things within slavery of how to do them or how these practices go. I think this is kind of God telling them, this is what you should do in these circumstances, but he's not saying it's okay. It's almost like if you had a friend that was getting evicted from their house, or like they had the threat of being evicted from their house, and the only other option was to pay some ridiculous raise in rent. Well, you don't agree that they should have to pay that. You might tell them, well, you should just pay it so you still have your house. And to go back to what you said about condoning, I think there's a difference between condoning in the sense of allowing something, which I agree that did happen, and condoning in the sense of like, I'm okay with that, or like, this is morally okay.
Well, I mean, if it wasn't morally okay, then why wouldn't God say so? Like, he had several chances to say it's not morally okay to do this. So why wouldn't he have said, hey, this isn't cool, guys, don't do this?
Well, I think we both know it was immoral. We agree on that. I just think that like I don't think it was really an option on, or not an option on the table. I don't think it was on like really something that was being discussed at the time. Nobody was talking about whether or not slavery was moral or immoral.
Well, see, but that's my point. Would you say that God is like it would be the moral lawgiver? Like God would know these things, right? Like God's all knowing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, God would know at the time, like, this is bad, don't do it. So I mean, we're not constrained by this like temporal knowledge of that time period. What we would be constrained by that, what we would be working with is God's absolute knowledge.
I'm not saying we're necessarily constrained by it as much as just like if God would have went to them with quantum physics, like it really wouldn't have made sense. You need prior knowledge. You need to build to that point. And obviously to us, we hear, oh, there we go. We hear that slavery is something that's, bad. We know that slavery is bad, but to these ancient people, like it's they hear that and they're just like, okay, like, but they're going to keep doing it. So I agree with what you're saying. Like, yeah, it would have been simple for God to just be like, yeah, slavery was bad, but that's not really what I think the law was about. I think the law was to get them to a different point.
Why did God need to get them to a different point, though? So, here's my thought. Let me explain a little bit more on that point, because in my view, the way that I read the Bible, I guess, which is, I guess, just the words on the page, it seems like God has a proclivity for commanding a lot of minute and small things, like for instance, and I can't remember which piece of scripture, but he basically lays out the exact plans for how to build a tabernacle and how to build a temple, how to encrust his the Ark of the Covenant in just the right way to where it pleases him. Like, he has all of these minute commandments about what to do, how to do them, and everything like that. That it seems like saying, hey guys, don't own people is kind of like, that's something that should have been said if he can dictate exactly how his temple should be built,
Yeah. No, I get that. But at the same time, again, these are things that, like, while they're pretty small things, they're also, and I have to be careful when I say reasonable, because, like, obviously it's reasonable to say that you shouldn't have slaves, but we're dealing with a different time period here. And I'm not saying that makes it okay. I'm saying that to these people, it's a much more progressive thing to them than it would be to us. So, like, God could have told us, 10 years ago, don't have slaves. And to us, we would take it a lot more seriously than they would during that time. Like, to them, it wouldn't really make it. There's just things that they don't follow. And we see that in the law. Like, there's already parts of the law that weren't followed.
No, I mean, I don't know. I guess that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because, like, God very specifically punishes the Israelite people for not following a lot of his very specific commands. And so it seems like the Israelites were expected, at least God expected them to follow his commands to the T. Like, even the most minute ones, he expected them to follow him. And when they didn't, when they strayed, he punished them. So it kind of seemed like God, at least, had the expectation that they would follow whatever he commanded. Is that not how it's portrayed in the Old Testament?
I don't think so. I think there's a lot of examples in the Old Testament where we can actually see the Israelites negotiating with God about the law and, like, various changes that, they felt should be made.
I'm gonna need a citation on that one.
Like the issue of divorce, for example, and I'm sure this is something that's probably come up for you, but God allowed divorce in the old law. But as we later find out, like, it's in many passages throughout the Bible, it's not something that God would have wanted. This is
sorry to interrupt, but I mean that whole part is in the New Testament. Where in the Old Testament does God say that divorce is not what I wanted, but what I'm going to allow right now? Also, and the follow up, you can address the first thing first, but follow up, does that also then in turn mean that God is not all powerful in some sense, because he felt like he couldn't command something that, of the Israelite people? But I'll let you answer that first thing first.
I know there is passage. I don't have it off the top of my head. But I know there are places where it talks about divorce and how divorce isn't ideal. I just don't have a specific passage in my head on that. But there is another example, like in Numbers 27. There's these two girls whose father didn't. They didn't have a son, and they were worried that their last name wasn't going to be passed on. And so they asked, well, if he could change the law around that. So, like, there's examples of the law being changed. I'm trying to think. I think it was in Joel. Let me see. I might have it in my document, actually.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, as far as, like, divorce goes, the only references I'm finding are in the New Testament.
But
And I
even at
mean,
that, I mean, we're talking about, the question is that the Bible condones slavery. So like even at that, we're talking about the Bible, and we're talking about
right.
the narrative that the Bible portrays. So even if we're gonna say like, oh yeah, this only happened in the Old Testament, or the New Testament, well, the New Testament is still part of the Bible. And
Okay.
I think that really what's important here is, because we're talking again about the Bible, my main beef with this whole issue is I think it kind of demonizes Christians. I think it paints Christians in this like, well, oh, they believe in this book that, supports slavery. And obviously, I don't think you're trying to do that. But when we're looking at the Bible, we have, these ancient passages that talk about slavery. And obviously, that's not ideal. But then we have the New Testament. And in the New Testament, it talks about how, like, the law wasn't really meant to lead to righteousness.
Okay.
So,
Well, so just from my own perspective, I see the Old Testament as being representative of what God intended, right? And so I get that there's the New Testament, but the New Testament, nowhere in it does it say slavery is bad, or in any way could it be interpreted that way. I know that you have some choice verses in the New Testament. We can talk about those if you would like to. But from my perspective, the Old Testament is representative of the Holy Bible because the Old Testament is included in the Holy Bible. The Old Testament condones and endorses slavery, so therefore the Bible condones and endorses slavery.
see, I think that's where we disagree, because I agree. And I have to be careful with the word endorse, because I don't think it endorses slavery. When you say endorse, are you saying like it promotes it as a good practice?
I'm saying that it promotes it. I'm not like, I feel like the Bible definitely has a normalized view of slavery. So like at that particular point in time, slavery is normalized. But the problem that I have with that is that God is not temporal, right? God is supposed to be eternal. He's not constrained to a certain point in time or anything like that. God is should know, like when God prescribed Leviticus 20, 25, 44 through 46, he knew that owning slaves was bad. Right. He just, before that, he commanded that the Israelites not boil a goat in its mother's milk, and they were expected to obey that. But yet later on, God's like, you know what? You can purchase slaves from the nations around you, and you can pass them down as inheritable property. So, I mean, like, it's hard to say that like God in the Old Testament wasn't perfectly fine with slavery, and it's only later Christians that reinterpreted things that then came away with saying slavery is bad, because on their own moral compass, for the period of time that they were in, they saw that as bad. So yes, the Old Testament has a normalized view of slavery, but I think that it has a normalized view of slavery because it was written by a man not inspired by God, and that they represented God as being a figure, like somehow a representative figure of themselves. So this representative figure of themselves obviously was perfectly fine with slavery as a normalized practice. So that's what I'm saying. They condoned it because it was normalized and it was seen as something that just exists and there's nothing wrong with it.
Okay. Yeah, I see. I think that's where we're disagreeing, is when you say like, oh, in the Old Testament God promoted slavery. I'm looking at the Bible holistically here. Like, I'm looking at the entire Bible, and I'm looking, okay, you have these passages here that talk about slavery, and when you just read that, like, okay, yeah, this maybe does seem like this is what's going on here. But then you continue reading and you see, okay, well, this here we have this example of God changing the law, God making an exception here. And so obviously, if this is, what God's perfect law, right? When you talk about like God's moral, he knows slavery is bad. So obviously that would be part of his perfect law. I think that this wasn't necessarily that law. And I think that that's evidenced in the New Testament and really parts throughout the Old Testament, where we see that the law changes, parts of the law are temporarily suspended, parts of the law only apply to certain things. And even in the case of like if the law was meant to be perfect, then there wouldn't be laws, for sacrifice, which is supposed to atone for sin, which sin is just going against the law. So obviously this law isn't really meant to be this perfect moral law. And I think that's where we're kind of going on a different path. Was in your eyes, God gave this law, and he said in this law that they were allowed to own slaves. So that means that God thinks slavery is okay. Whereas I'm saying, well, God gave this law, but he didn't give this law to be, necessarily for moral reasons as much as functional reasons. So maybe God wanted Israel to practice certain things. A big argument that's used here that I don't have much passages to kind of express this, but I do agree with that a lot of the things in the law were meant to make Israel stand out in comparison to the nations around them. So you talked about like the other laws. There definitely were more laws that gave people more rights, especially women's rights. And I just wish I had more. I could, reference these laws because it would make it a lot, more specific.
Well, unless one of those laws is don't own another person as property, I don't see how it helps your situation.
I just think that's kind of I don't want to call it closed-minded and sound, like I'm attacking you, but I feel like that take isn't very open for discussion. I don't see how either the Bible has to say that slavery is immoral or the Bible condones slavery. I don't see.
Well, so the reason why I'm expecting this, which I do have a verse to bring up as far as like whether or not God's law is like, supposed to be perfect or anything, but the reason why I'm bringing it up is because the whole idea of God not supporting slavery is a very modern interpretation. We only in the modern time have developed this interpretation of God's word. Prior to that, there was no question about it. Like everybody understood the assignment, and they definitely
how modern.
How modern? I mean. Yeah. When I say modern, I'm talking about like, when the abolitionist movement started, at least here in the United States, maybe, or just whenever slavery started to be abolished, like by Christian communities, I guess, like whenever they started developing this theology, that's what I mean by modern. In this particular context, as far as the history of Christianity goes, it's fairly modern, is what I mean. And so, I mean, I'm just saying that surefire way for God to not be misunderstood and for people to not misinterpret his words is to directly put in there, not cool to own people as slaves, bro. Just stop. Like that would have set the Israelites apart in the ancient Near East. That would have definitely solidified like, hey, what's going on here? Like it would have been noticeable if that were to have happened, but it didn't happen.
It would have been noticeable if that would have happened. But the problem is that trying to get an entire ancient society to make such a and again, to us, it's not radical. The idea of slavery being bad is, common, that makes sense. But to them, it was a radical idea. So to try to get them to just convert to this radical idea, God is coming to these people in a sense of like, hey, he's trying to get these people somewhat on his side. It is in some ways a negotiation. He might be God, but he also does respect free will. And he's not just going to come in and, force these people to do his way. Now, yeah, there's the question of like examples where he punishes people. And you could bring up the verse about the Pharaoh. We could get into that. But I think that all kind of just goes down different avenues of what we're talking about.
Okay. Well, as far as all that goes, I still have to harken back to the whole fact that God prescribes very small things that seem to be that would be out of place for a lot of cultures at the time.
These are ritualistic laws in a lot of cases too. Sorry to cut you off, but I think that's an important distinction.
How does that matter?
Well, because there's laws about the way that you're supposed to live your life, right? There's laws like, like the slavery laws and random different laws. But then there's laws about, rituals. And in the ritual laws, these are laws that are being practiced by, the people that are doing the ritual. So there's a very specific way that this is going to be done. It's a lot different than like a moral law that's being given out. And there's moral laws and then there's ritualistic laws. But I don't think to say like, oh, he wants something done specifically in a ritual, and then to compare that to like a moral law, that's very different.
So, I mean, I understand what you're talking about here, but I'm also not drawing the distinction between ritualistic laws and moral laws. Like, I'm drawing a distinction as to how specific, minute, or inconsequential the commandment is. And I feel like these ritualistic laws are very minute and inconsequential on the whole. And so God felt that he could do that and expect them to carry out those particular commandments. And so I feel like making don't own people as slaves as part of some kind of ritualistic sense or anything like that would be easy for God. And I think that admitting that God couldn't do this because they wouldn't follow it is sort of admitting that God is like not all powerful, or like he was limited.
That was the thing you brought up earlier. So I don't think that there's a comparison there, because just because you're all powerful doesn't mean that you can. There's certain things that, like, God is all powerful. He can do anything that power can do. But if you're trying to do something and you're trying to, there's multiple factors. Like, for example, trying to maintain free will. If you're trying to create a society of people with free will, you can't just force these people to do what you want them to do. So,
but God does that all the time.
Say it again.
God does that all the time.
Okay.
Do you think the Israelites' free will wanted to encrust the Ark of the Covenant like God had them do, or that of their free will, the Israelite people wanted to build the temple exactly how God wanted it built?
These were things that they were willing to do. There's a difference.
And they could be willing to not own another person as a slave.
They're not. These are ancient barbaric people.
Well, why does that matter when it comes to God and his moral commands?
Well, because God can give out moral commands. God can say, okay, you can't do this. But if this is something that they're already doing, and it's something that's already part of their society, they're just going to continue doing it. And God is trying to create a society here with people with free will. That's the whole point of like the God of the Bible. He made people with free will. So to say like, oh yeah, just because God can't force these people to do this, this means he doesn't have free will. Well, that doesn't really make any sense.
Well, that's not what I said. I said that God could expect them to adhere to don't own other people as property. He could expect that of them, just like he expects a multitude of other things for him. So I guess my point is, I don't feel like you're making a distinction here as to why God had to allow slavery at the time. I feel like he could just expect.
I think there's many social things that were allowed in the law that today we would look at, we wouldn't necessarily have as part of our law. But that doesn't mean that God thinks that those things are okay. Just like divorce, which is something that's kind of like, we see divorce happen in our society all the time and we think it's not a big deal. But to them, the concept of getting divorced was much different. Religious or marriage is like a religious institution. So it's changed over time. But in the law, it said not to get divorced. And then God allowed divorce later on.
Right. So a good point to bring up here is, and this is inspired from one of my friends here on TikTok, the Bible guy. Creating statues of your God and everything like that was very much the norm at this time, but God directly commanded against that particular action. So it seems like God doesn't really have a problem with commanding something that's against the norm of the time.
I'm not saying he has a problem changing the norm as much as so again, when God put this law in place, his goal is to distinguish Israel from the other nations, right? That's what I'm trying to say. So, and it's not like, and morally, the other nations they're not looking at slavery and thinking, oh, what a nation that's ahead of us would look like is a nation without slaves. They don't think that way. And they don't necessarily think about like ahead and this and that. The point of not having statues of your God is to show that like our God wasn't a physical God. So that's a distinction there. It's not necessarily meant to be. Isn't thinking ahead and providing a better way to live God's responsibility? No. Why would
No?
that be God's response? No.
I mean, I guess I feel like God prescribing these moral laws, telling his people how they should live and how they should worship him and everything like that. I feel like that's him prescribing ways for them to live a better way, or at least prescribing the best way for their society to operate. So why that then the question goes to, why wasn't not owning other people as slaves a way to operate, like the better way to operate?
Well, I don't think, like I said, I don't really think that I think we're kind of talking past each other about this, because I don't think this is a moral law. Like, I don't think God is putting this law in place to be like, okay, this is how I want my people to live in terms of what the most perfect moral way is. And I think when we read passages like in Peter, it says that, the law wasn't put in place to give righteousness, but to teach us until righteousness came. So I think that you're looking at the law and you're seeing like, okay, well, slavery was allowed. And that means that the God of the Bible is saying that slavery is okay. And that means that the Bible says slavery is okay. And I'm looking at this as, well, you have this ancient law that did allow these ancient people to have slaves, but this law wasn't God saying, okay, this is the law of the land. This is what needs to exist forever. Because if it was, then I don't see how he would have came along later and been like, okay, this law is going down. This law isn't in place. The law is dead, right? So I think you're looking at the Bible and more of and as you should, because this is, what you believe in. It's more of a secular approach. Like, okay, here's the Old Testament and here's the New Testament, which was written much later. And to you, it's changing their mind. Whereas to me, it's one continuous narrative. Like, okay, yeah, I could see why you would think this is suspicious by itself. But if you look at the whole thing, you can see, okay, these laws weren't really there to create a new social system as much as to teach them how to live within the social system that they had.
Well, so I guess the way that I'm taking it is from a very, engineer's perspective, but obviously engineer. And so the way that I take it is that, God in the Old Testament is supposed to be the God of the New Testament, right?
Yes.
Okay, so they're the same God. Jesus is also considered to be God, right? Like Jesus is God in the flesh.
The Trinity, yeah.
Right. Okay. So the way that I see it is from a very analytical position, and that analytical position sees that God is supposed to be this omniscient, omnipresent, omnibenevolent being. If he is those things, and part of omnibenevolence would be that, slavery doesn't exist. At least as we understand it now, slavery is a violation of basic human rights. It's a violation of the free will aspect of humanity. However you want to interpret free will, like it's a violation of basic rights of humans. You would think that if God was concerned with that, like the free will of his people, then he would have said, don't own people as property. But you see him constantly reaffirming that it's okay to own people as slaves. Even in the New Testament, you have verses that affirm that it's the norm to own people as slaves, and even reinforces the fact that people can own slaves. Even if it's controlled in some kind of way, you can still own people as slaves.
So I think that I still think that we're kind of like talking past each other, because when, like, again, I'm not like, when God puts these laws out, right? Exodus, 20, Leviticus, I think chapter, is it 25 or 45? Whichever one. When he puts these laws out, he's not saying, okay, this is okay. And to the point of what you're saying, just because God isn't giving out specific things saying, oh, slavery is bad, that doesn't mean that we can't, come to the conclusion that slavery is bad, obviously independently of the Bible. But even using the Bible talks about, loving your neighbor. There's all sorts of examples in the Bible of like Proverbs that say, the unpaid worker, or having an unpaid worker, is a curse. There's different examples throughout the Bible where we can see that the idea of slavery is not considered the best. There's examples of Nehemiah talking about the treatment of slaves, Philemon, even I believe it's Second Peter. One of the epistles describes the suffering as slaves and goes as far as to compare it to the suffering of Christ. So, like, and obviously, no Christian is going to say that the suffering of Christ is good, right? This was a bad thing. This was an unjust thing, and this was something that kind of had to happen. And I think that that's kind of the same thing that's happening here. Just because the Bible isn't explicitly saying that slavery is bad doesn't mean that you can take the verses that say, you know, in this instance, slavery was allowed and run with it and say, oh, that means that the Bible's saying slavery is good. Because there's a lot of counter examples that you could pull up. And I think it's not productive to play the contradiction game where, like, you'll see one verse in the Bible that you think means one thing, and then you'll find another verse that means another, like, you know, love thy neighbor seems to be going against slavery, and say, oh, well, this is just a big contradiction, so none of it's true anyways. I don't think that's productive either.
Well, so the problem that I have with what was the verse that you had just mentioned?
I can pull it up. It's Second Peter. It's in Second Peter.
Yeah. Well, that one is specifically against the unjust treatment of slaves, not slavery itself. So there's a bit of a nuance here, and I noticed in your document that you gave me that there's you regularly ignore, you know, the nuances of the passages, because like in 2 Peter or 2 Peter there, you know, the nuance is it's unjust treatments. And that's always been a thing in the Bible. Like, there's always been some kind of laws around the just treatment of slaves, but that doesn't mean that they're saying slavery is bad. Just like in the Philemon thing, in the Philemon reference that you have, where Onesius, I believe it is, Paul is not in that particular instance advocating for the release of all slaves or to say that slavery is bad. He's just leaving it up to, you know, the owner there to release him so that he can come and be like a missionary with Paul. And so it's not a condemnation of slavery.
Sorry to cut you off, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that in that passage or in the Peter passage that anyone's advocating for the abolition of slavery, because again, you know, these people aren't really in positions where they can do that, where they have the power to make legal change in that sense. But I do think that this kind of sheds light on the fact that, you know, if Paul wanted this one slave to be freed, if Peter sees the suffering of slaves as unjust, then obviously to some extent, these people feel that the system of slavery is unjust. To some extent, it can be said that. And if I can make that, if you can make a jump and say that, oh yeah, this passage right here says that slaves be obedient to your masters, this means that they're okay with it, then I think it's perfectly just as reasonable to make the same jump in the other direction.
Well, see, I don't see it that way, because primarily because of the fact that they don't say slavery is bad or something that could be interpreted. But that's like kind of an argument from silence. To say that just because it doesn't say that means that this conclusion has to be the case is literally an argument from silence. No, well, I mean, whether it's an argument for silence or not, regardless of that, it's still a strong argument with the fact that they don't say slavery's bad, don't own slaves. Like, that is clear cut what they should have said if they actually thought that. But what we get are these passages that affirm slavery. Like, I know in your document you reference the Council of Orleans, I think it is, the Council of Orleans, where they mandate that slaves that are running away from their masters get returned or have a safe haven in the church, right? So if they flee to a church, they're protected by the church. But what you don't say is the fact that even in, I believe it's like 538 or something like that, and this is the third council of the Orleans, they specifically say, well, it's not that we're protecting the slave because the slave shouldn't be in bondage to their master. It's that we're going to protect the slave, and then we're going to negotiate with the slave master to not punish the slave so harshly for running away, and that is the only way that the church will give the slave back. So basically, the church negotiates the punishment for the slave, and the punishment can't be too harsh, but the slave is ultimately given back, showing that even in 538 AD, or CE, however you want to say it, they are still in the normative state of slavery, which shows that if God, even past the New Testament, was very much against slavery and that Christians were against slavery, it seems like a prime fucking time for them to be like, slavery's bad, we're not giving him back, he's a free soul now. Like, that seems like that would be the prime time to do it. It would avert so much shitty shit that would happen in history, after 538. It seems like they would want to do that, but they don't, because slavery is still normalized. They still think that God is good with slavery, and so they do things in accordance with what they think will please God.
So yeah, I don't think that that's a very reasonable take on the situation at all, because so first of all, the Catholic Church can't, and again, people aren't property, but this is what it was considered at the time. And the Catholic Church can't just say, okay, well, I'm going to, take this property, even though, again, it's not property, but that's what it's considered in law. You can't just do that. The Catholic Church doesn't have the power just to do that. So there's that to start. But your whole thing here, and I'm not trying to, come at you in any kind of way, but it's basically just that, okay, the Bible says this, but it never once says that slavery is bad. So that means that the conclusion I've drawn from this is 100% the case, because it can't be anything else. Even if the conclusion I've drawn from this has been undercut by so many other things, that conclusion is true because the Bible doesn't say that slavery is bad. And whether or not the Bible says slavery is bad, it doesn't matter. That's completely irrelevant to what I'm saying and what you're talking about here. You're saying that these passages in the New Testament or in the Old Testament indicate that God thinks slavery is good. And I'm telling you that I don't think that these passages say that, because these passages aren't based on God's morality as much as what God thinks is important at the time. So
slavery was important at the time?
No, but these laws that were given were important at the time.
These laws that were given were important at the time, and it was important not to say, don't own people as property.
No, that's not what I said. Okay. How would that come from what I said?
Well, I mean, if you're saying that the laws that God gave at the time were important and that it was important for people to know where they can purchase their slaves, it kind of seems like it's important to not mention that it's wrong to own slaves.
So again, it's not supposed. When I say it's important for the purpose that God had intended, and the purpose wasn't to create this perfect moral law. And
the intent was to have the Israelites own people as slaves.
No, that wasn't the intent.
It seems considering he was telling people how to own slaves.
There's more to the law than just slavery, though. You're taking these passages about slavery and you're saying, okay, yeah, this is why God put this law here. There's more to it than slavery. The purpose of the law has very little to do with slavery. The only reason slavery is mentioned in the law is because it was such a big practice throughout the ancient world. The purpose of the law isn't to do away with these practices or to change mankind away from these practices.
And again, I'll mention that creating idols of your gods and everything like that was a common practice, but yet God still felt the need to dictate to Christian or to the Israelites at the time.
Go on, sorry.
Well, he felt it necessary to dictate, don't make any kind of idols of me, even though idols were a common practice. So it kind of seems to be contrary to what you're talking about here.
So I don't think it is contrary, because if, these ancient cultures, right, say you have culture A, who makes idols of their god, they believe that their God wants them to do that, and that's why they're doing that, and that's why they're worshiping these idols. If you have culture B, which is the Israelites, and is saying that, don't create idols of me, then why would that be like a big cultural change? Why would that be such a big deal if your God is telling, okay, you don't have to do that? If anything, it's less work for them.
I'm sorry, I thought that you were making the case that that slavery was just culturally acceptable at the time. Everybody was practicing it. It was normalized and all this other kind of stuff. And so therefore that's why God didn't outlaw it, but yet there are other normalized things in the ancient Near East. Therefore, it seems like if these things were normalized in the ancient Near East, idol worship, then it should have been just as okay for him to say to the Israelites, that's fine, you can make a visage of me or anything like that. Like, I don't care about that. Like, it seems very cherry picking to me. Like, you're cherry picking which things are
that's not the
important
case.
or not.
I'm not making the case that, because slavery was something that, was an ancient practice, that makes it morally okay, or that makes it, that's the reason God allowed it. I'm saying that wasn't an issue on the table at the time. It's not something that God was really concerned with doing away with. And it's not something that, even if God, was doing away with slavery at that time, it wouldn't have happened. It just, like, you can't force a society to do away with this. It's not something that would have happened. So on one hand, there is a level of like, yeah, this was an ancient practice. This is what they were doing. But it's not that God doesn't want to encroach upon that, or God, doesn't want to be overbearing. It's that there literally is that's not going to happen. That's not something that these people are going to do. Just like right now, obviously in this perfect world that God created before the garden, which I have my own mixed beliefs on that, but that's whatever. In this world, supposedly there was no animals dying, right? So our entire world, we would just be eating fruits and vegetables and stuff. If God were to come here now and say, okay, everyone, you have to stop eating meat, it would seem crazy. It would seem like a big change. But yet, in hundreds of years, we could work to a point where that's what we're doing. So, like, it's something that takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. And I think that that's where we're, like, kind of disconnecting here, is that you seem to think God could just come down and be like, okay, no more slaves. And there would just be no more slaves. That's not how it would work.
I mean, didn't God come down and make a bunch of commandments and expect them to immediately obey them? Like, I feel like that's the entire Moses 10 commandments on the fucking
many of these commandments
thing.
Okay, but many of these commandments are much different than this. Like, again, many of them are ritualistic, and it's not really something.
Well, hold on. So part of the 10 commandments is like, don't covet your neighbor's property, which includes women, by the way, which that's another thing that we can get into, because God definitely condones sexual slavery, in several parts of the Bible, which is another form of slavery. So it's definitely on this topic, but we can get to that later if you want to. But I mean, God literally, with his lightning dick, wrote down 10 commandments that are supposed to be the way that they are supposed to govern. The first 4 of these motherfuckers are stroking his ego. It's stroking his ego. The first 4 are stroking it. And like, he couldn't take 1 to stroke his ego, and then the other 3 to be like, women are not property, nobody else's property, also don't fuck kids. Like, I feel like that is a reasonable expectation from a supposedly omniscient God that would know exactly how his religion that he's building, his group of people, are going to affect the world in future history. Like, that's not an unreasonable expectation on my part.
I've been in the same shoes as you are with the same line of reasoning, where but mine was a little different. I was under this idea, well, why, like, even if the Bible doesn't support slavery or endorse it, why is it that there's these questionable verses there? Because, here we are arguing about this when, like, if these verses, like you said, it could say that slavery is not there. But I think that in part that's us viewing it as like, oh yeah, he wrote this for us. He didn't, this wasn't written for us. This was written, like, yeah, we can read it later on, and yeah, people say it's the word of God, and it is, but the word of God was written in many parts, and it was written for many different purposes and to many different people. So these ancient laws were written for the Israelites. These laws were there for them. And this is the law that they had at the time. So,
but okay, so in your view, is God the moral arbiter of humanity?
What do you define? Because, like, moral arbiter to me, I don't think God is supposed to be like a moral policeman.
I mean, I'm not saying the policeman enforces the law, which I think that, there's several instances of modern Christians thinking, or at least presenting God as being that. But regardless of that, what I'm saying is that God is laying the moral foundation for humanity. God is the moral is the moral foundation. Like he provides the moral foundation. He is the foundation from which all morality is based off of, right?
Yes, I believe that.
Okay.
Yeah, like I think, like the passage says, He's written His law in all of our hearts.
Okay, so why is this moral foundation mutable?
Why is it what?
Mutable? Sorry. This might be the software engineer in me. Mutable meaning changing. Why does God seem to change his moral foundation depending upon which community he seems to be addressing at a particular point in time in history? Because it seems like if God is the moral arbiter of like how people should live, or like what is the best way to live, or God prescribes moral oughts, then it seems like you ought not own another person as property would be one of the prime fucking things that you would prescribe.
So I think that there's an objective moral standard, right? That maybe you don't believe in it, but I think it's there. And I think that humans have, throughout history, progressively more and more gotten closer to this objective standard. But I don't believe that like if you're asking if I think that the law that was given in Exodus, if I think that that is an example or like a window into that, I don't. That's the point I'm trying to make, is I don't think that it is.
Okay,
like just because something is in, sorry to cut you off, but just because something is allowed or disallowed in the law, it doesn't to me mean that it is moral or immoral according to God, or even just in general.
Well, so I mean, considering that it's normalized at the time of the Old Testament, it seems like it would fall into the category of either morally good or morally neutral. So, I mean, personally...
Why would it be morally good and morally neutral? Like, I would think that anything would just fall into it's morally bad, or it's morally good, or they just don't know, which I guess would be morally neutral.
Yeah. So I mean, you agree with me. There's three categories: morally good, morally neutral, and morally bad.
Like the two categories about morally good, morally bad, this is talking about objectively. Like, this is like, regardless of what you or I think, it's good or bad. But then there's the like, was this person in the wrong for doing this? Which in some senses you could say that slave owners, I do think they were on the wrong. Obviously slavery was wrong, but in another sense, they weren't acting in the wrong. Like, they didn't know that they were doing something that was wrong, which doesn't make it okay, but it's hard to put moral blame on them for that.
No, I put moral blame on God in the Bible, because God is supposed to be omniscient. He knows it's wrong, right? Would you agree that God knows it's wrong to own another person as property?
Yeah, absolutely.
Then why wouldn't he communicate that shit to his chosen people?
Because the communication that he was making wasn't supposed to be a list of, hey, this is what's right, this is what's wrong, this is what needs to, like, that's where we're like kind of parting ways here, because you're saying that this law has to be based on God's moral standard. I'm saying that it's not. The law was put there as a teacher.
I'm sorry. No, this is such a foreign concept to me, because it's like in the Bible, God literally commands things. Like, he tells them that they should do these things. He doesn't provide justification for it anywhere in the Bible. And also, I believe it's, hold on, let me check my notes here. Psalm 19:7, where it says, the law of the Lord is perfect.
Yeah, so perfect is also used to refer to Noah, and obviously Noah sinned. Job also is referred to as perfect, using that same Hebrew word. That word doesn't mean perfect in the sense of like this person or thing is morally without error. It's saying that it has a good function. It is what the Lord wants. So
Right. The Lord wants you to purchase people from the nations around you.
no, that's not. See, that's taking an extra step that you don't need to take.
No, it's not.
It is. No, it
I'm sorry.
absolutely
I'm
is.
sorry. I don't mean to laugh at you or anything, but it's just it is kind of funny.
I think the laughing helps you to feel more confident in what you're saying, but what you're saying is still wrong, right?
It's not wrong.
it is
God
wrong, 'cause
literally says you can purchase people from the states from the nations around you, and then he goes on in later verses.
That doesn't, just because it says, oh, you're allowed to do this, doesn't mean that God is saying, oh yeah, this is morally okay.
Okay, so let me ask you this.
You're saying that because these passages say this, that God says it's morally okay, but that's not what God is saying. And then you're saying, well, if God doesn't say it's not okay somewhere else, that means it's okay.
But if it was bad, wouldn't you expect God to tell them that it was bad?
But it doesn't, that doesn't matter, because we're not talking about like a moral law here.
Why doesn't it matter?
Because I think you want God, like you want this to be like, oh yeah, God is saying this stuff is good, this stuff is bad. That's not what the law is about. That's not what this ancient law was there for.
Okay, sorry, I had to. Have you gotten those like those what are the verification things where you got to drag the puzzle piece over and you got to like put it in the spot? For some reason, it was like, I don't think you're a real person, Godless engineer, and so like it had me verify that I was not a bot. Sorry, can you repeat what you just said? I was totally like,
No, you're good. So I think that what we have is the law, all these passages that you're referring to. And we can say, we can talk about the other ones in the epistles later, but specifically for the law, I think that you're looking at this law as, okay, God gave these laws. These are what God thinks is a morally perfect law. But we have these other passages where it says, okay, the law is dead, that the law wasn't, man, I wish I had the specific passages, but that the law wasn't there to lead us to righteousness, because if a perfect law could be given, it would have. But it was there to lead us to, because because the passage said it, if a perfect law could be given, it would have. There's no law that God could have gave these people that would have made them perfect people. If he could have done that, he would have.
So God's not all powerful then?
That doesn't, no, because it's not a matter of power, because he could do anything, but there's no law that he could give given them that would have made them perfect people, because they wouldn't have either followed it, or the law wouldn't be perfect.
I'm sorry, this is such a foreign concept to me, because the whole the whole I guess agency of God is for him to prescribe these laws that people are supposed to follow, and that God is expecting people to follow these things no matter how ridiculous it is. I mean, honestly, the way that I see God, especially in the Old Testament, is that he could have told them, every third Sunday, you need to put tassels in your asshole and spin around on your head, whipping them about to the tune of Little John, every third Sunday of the month. And God would have expected them to do that, because that is what the character of God portrays in the Old Testament.
But you're taking these very small ritualistic things that these people practiced anyways. Like they were doing we would look at it as weird. They were doing their little rituals before that. So God telling them specific things within their rituals was no different than God telling them specific things within their slavery. These very, small laws that you see were just as much part of their everyday life as our laws would be for us.
And why? So why couldn't not owning people as property be part of that?
Because again, this law isn't there. God isn't trying to recreate their whole social system here. He's giving them laws to live within the system that they live in.
Isn't God creating a social system for the Israelites? Like, I thought that was the entire point. Like of Moses going up there on the mountain and jerking off for 40 days and 40 nights.
Yeah, but there's that system, but there's the overall humanity, and humanity just wasn't at a place where that was like something that was going to happen, and that's just not feasible.
But humanity was at a part in history where they could perfectly encrust the Ark of the Covenant just so that God could fuck himself with it.
Doing. Yes, because these were things that they were already doing within their society. It's not that crazy for them to have done these things.
But so what I'm hearing is that God was bound by the rules of humanity.
No,
at that point.
That's not what I'm saying. You keep kind of going in
no, I'm not trying to do any of that. I'm just trying to understand what the fuck you're saying, because it's like, on one hand, God is confined to what humanity would expect, and then on the other hand, God is not confined because he's God and he's all powerful. So it doesn't make fucking sense to me for God to be both combined and confined and all powerful.
All-powerful has nothing to do with, like, an all-powerful being can do anything that power can do. But if you have a goal that is complicated, there's multiple factors that have to be at play. So if you're trying to create a full society of people that all have agency and free will, and you want these people to get to a point where they believe in this moral standard that you've set forth, you can't just show up and change the standards that they have. You can tell them, you can lead them, you can tell them to it, but they're not just going to change. And he knows that, and he needs this treaty, this covenant with Israel to work out so that his plan, with Jesus and all of this can go forward. It's not just about God just showing up and setting a standard.
No, I mean, he does, but he does. He shows up. Like, for instance, he shows up and he sets the standard. I am God. You only worship me, and only worshiping me is allowed in your society.
And they didn't even listen to that.
Right, but
so that didn't prevent.
But that didn't prevent God from saying that. So why is God prevented from saying don't own people?
Because that's something that's so much bigger. That's so much bigger. Like
so much bigger?
Yes, slavery was I know it's crazy to think about, but slavery was a very big part of the ancient world.
You know what was a big part of the ancient world? Acknowledging that other gods existed. Like, other gods existing was the thing. Even by the Jews.
Acknowledged that other gods existed. It's acknowledged that other gods exist within the commandment by saying not to worship other gods. That's acknowledged.
Right. So it seems like it's
asking those are very different things. And again,
how are they
society
function. I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. I just don't understand it, because
how do you not understand how it's different? What about that?
Well, because God is giving commandments. One commandment: only worship me, don't make any idols of me, and all that kind of good shit, even though everybody else is doing all of these things. Every other, I don't know how many other societies in the ancient world allowed multiple religions to worship in their city or in their people or whatever. But, you're only to worship me, and I'm going to punish you if you allow anybody else to worship other gods in the society, because that's happened in the Old Testament, right? So, this is something that's very contrary to the ancient Near East at that particular time. So them also saying don't own another person as property seems to be of lesser value than don't worship any other gods.
It's so it seems like lesser value. It's that it's of lesser impact to the society. The whole economic society revolved around this concept of slavery. This is literally how society functioned.
And you don't think that worshiping one particular god
on a social level, sure, but you would have to reshape all of society to do, and that's besides the point. Ultimately, we have counterexamples here. You're saying, why would God allow this within his law if it's not okay? We have counterexamples of things that are allowed in the law that God didn't consider to be okay, and you're just kind of ignoring those things and saying, well, nowhere in the law does it say that slavery is bad, which is kind of just an argument from silence. And you kind of went back and said, well, okay, even if it is an argument from silence, it's a strong argument. Well, that's not a strong argument. That's a fallacy.
No. Argument from silence is not a fallacy. There are strong arguments from silence, especially when we expect, whatever thing that is silent, if we expect it to be mentioned on a certain view, then it's a strong argument from
but that's a whole
silence.
debate within and of itself, as if we would expect it to be mentioned. Because again, we wouldn't expect it to be mentioned within this
Okay. Here's how we would expect it to be mentioned, and you can. I'll allow you to answer. Is God omniscient?
Yes.
Is God the moral arbiter, or is he the moral lawgiver of humanity?
You can't just ask a string of questions and then like combine them into what you want.
I'm trying to establish it.
Yes. Go ahead.
Yes. Is slavery morally abhorrent?
Yes.
Okay. Does God know that slavery is morally abhorrent?
Yes.
Given that God is the moral arbiter of humanity and God knows that slavery is morally abhorrent, then God should prescribe that slavery is morally abhorrent, but we don't find that. Because we don't find that, that means that God is either normalized to it, like he's fine with it, or he tacitly condones it, like he thinks that it's a moral good to own people.
And that I know that's not true, because just because God knows something is morally apprehensible, there's many like 200 years from now, right? There's things that we do today on a daily basis that people are going to look at and say that is morally reprehensible. There's things that if we were told that we were doing that are considered morally reprehensible, we would look at somebody like they're crazy. So just because God knows that something is morally reprehensible does not mean he's going to impose this on a group of people. Because again, he's all knowing. So he's not going to impose this on a group of people who he knows it's not going to receive well. Now you would question, okay, well, if he can't make these people do this, is he all powerful? Yes, he is still all powerful, because the whole point here is that he has a group of free-willed individuals that he is trying to get to agree to this moral standard that he is trying to set. So
I'm still so very confused. Well, you lost me at the whole fact that like God, so God prescribes a lot of things in the Old Testament, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even very small things, like minute things, like don't boil a goat in its mother's milk. Like that's incredibly specific. Jedediah at one point did that, and everybody was like, "We dislike this." Kind of thing, and so they wrote it down in their laws and all this other kind of stuff. And so like all of these things right here are very minute specific things, ritualistic or moral, which is a very modern concept, this whole distinction and the different kinds of laws, by the way. But all of that is understood, but yet God still prescribes slavery. Like God still says, this is where you buy your slaves from. Like I get lost at the fact that God is confined by what the Israelites would expect or what they would follow. God has no problem. God, I don't know if you know this, Joey, but God one time created out of thin air a fucking sarlacc pit in the middle of the desert and swallowed up a whole bunch of Israelites just because they were mouthy. It's not they were like, we're not doing this shit. They were a little mouthy about God and the prescriptions that he has given. And so he created a sarlacc pit and he swallowed them up in the middle of the desert. Like, what are you saying, that he has no ability or he has no expectation of them following these rules when he prescribes rules, and then when they don't follow them, he creates a goddamn sarlacc pit to swallow them up? Like it just doesn't follow for me.
So I'm gonna say like one more, because I do have to get going here in a few minutes. I'm gonna say like That's one fine. More thing, and then we can have one more little back and forth. To like the sarlacc pit, and there's different examples of stuff like that, like the two bears, and there's all kinds of stuff. I'm not saying that God doesn't have the ability to enforce his law or to push people in the direction of his law. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that the abolition of slavery, like the abolition of slavery 200 years ago, was looked at by some as like, well, this is crazy. This is a big deal. And like now we look at it like that should have happened. That absolutely should have happened. And it should have happened sooner. So I just think that what you're expecting or maybe you're neglecting is the fact that these people are very built into what they're doing. And such a big thing, like just removing that aspect of their life is something that, God could have came to them and be like, yeah, okay, if you have slaves, I will create bears and send them after you to eat you, or I will, burn you or shoot you with lightning. He could have. But then these people aren't going to listen to him. And he's going to end up having he's going to end up having to either kill everybody or he's going to have to concede on his law. Like your idea that God can just, kill people or create a Sarlacc pit.
Sorry. Because it's TikTok, you got to say unalive.
Oh, sorry, unalive. Yeah. I didn't know that. I never get.
It's a weird thing here on TikTok. I don't understand it. You'd think they'd pick up on it, but I'm just saying, like in the future, just say unalive.
Yeah, sorry about that, but
no, it's fine.
This idea that God could just do this and punish these people, I think, is kind of overlooking the fact that like these people aren't going to listen to him to begin with if he starts changing things so radically. And it's really not that he needs to negotiate with them as much as he needs to have a covenant with these people so that he can fulfill the promise through these people to send Jesus and all that stuff that you don't really believe in. So like, it's kind of hard to have this conversation, I think, for the both of us, because I'm believing in what I believe in based off of like, okay, this is what happened here and this is what happened here. Whereas you're looking at it like, okay, here's the Old Testament, this is what this says, and then later on, this says it here. So, I mean, if that makes sense. I think we're kind of talking past each other. I don't think we disagree about so much here.
I mean, I don't see us talking past each other. The way that I interpret God as presented in the Bible is that he's the moral foundation. He's the moral lawgiver, right? And that the moral lawgiver of humanity once laid down laws that it was okay to own another person as slaves, which maybe sometime in the future we can get into the smexual slavery that exists like in Numbers 31, as well as like other portions of the Old Testament. But he allows different kinds of slavery to exist. He's perfectly fine with it. It's normalized to him. So it's either morally gray, which is meaning that it was just normalized, like it wasn't seen as good or bad, or it was a good thing to own slaves. Either way they want to go about it, both of those things are not congruent with our current understanding of morality and our current understanding of human agency and our current understanding of what it means to be a decent person. If God, as proclaimed by the Bible, is supposed to be omniscient and omnipresent and all this other stuff, omnibenevolent mostly, then we should expect God to prescribe omnibenevolent laws. But we don't find that in the Old Testament. So if we're talking past each other, I feel like you're actually degrading this concept of God, whereas I'm taking the concept of God as presented in the Bible at its purest, as what it's supposed to be.
So I'll just close on this. I don't think that the concept of God is this, like, I don't think it's as cut and dry as when you go to church what they say. I don't think the concepts in the Bible are as cut and dry as when you go to church what they say. I think that, a lot of it is stuff you have to, read up on. You have to understand philosophy. You have to understand theology. And I think that's something you've done. I'm not saying you haven't. But this idea that God would have, it's like if he wanted to, he would have kind of thing. I just think that maybe if he wanted to, he would have. But at the same time, it could be said that maybe then just wasn't the time to do it. Maybe there was a better time to do it. And I think that a better time was sending Jesus, was seeing, saying things like, be a good neighbor, love your neighbor, stuff like that. I think to many Christians, I don't think for me, when I first heard about this slavery issue, I laughed at it because I was like, what do you mean the Bible promotes slavery? That's insane. The Bible is this loving book. And then I read the Bible and I started to understand where a lot of atheists were coming from with this stuff. And so I do have I don't want to say sympathy, but I do have I understand where you're coming from with it. But I think that with a little bit, when I say talking past each other, I think a big part of it is because we're coming from different beliefs.
Yeah. I mean, maybe, but I'm coming at it from a very engineering perspective, and I take the Bible as being sort of a requirements document that describes not only God but also what God wants, right? What God considers to be good and all this other stuff. And it's a very foreign concept to me to think about God as being restricted in any kind of sense, like by what humans that he is like commanding would accept. Like, that's just a very foreign concept to me. And more importantly, though, I don't think that it's actually laid out in the Bible at all that God should be confined to what humans would expect. I feel like that degrades God, this concept of God that's presented in the Bible.
That's definitely fair. I do have to get going here, but that I could definitely see where you're coming from with that, and I think a lot of Christians would agree with you, especially when I start pulling out words like the moral concession hypothesis. I understand why a lot of people would see that and be like, okay, well, like especially from an atheist perspective, like that's literally what you're saying is that God is making moral concessions, but it's not that simple. I don't think the issue is as cut and dry as okay, it says it here, it doesn't say it here, it must mean this. But we could definitely talk more about this. I know we've kind of went in, kind of covered everything, but there's definitely more topics, like you said, different atrocities in the Bible that we could, I don't know what I can and can't say, but definitely there's more we could talk about.
Yeah. TikTok's a little weird. I'm just trying not to catch like a ban
or Discord or whatever works for you. Honestly, I did TikTok because that's what I'm always on.
Oh yeah, no, I'm totally fair. I mean, I feel like doing it here on TikTok is the easiest thing. It's mostly for you. I'm an old fuck, so like I didn't even know how to change the fucking layout. So like it, kind of thing. I do appreciate you, reaching out to me and wanting to have the conversation and everything like that. I do appreciate the very progressive view that you take on the Bible, but I feel like we are talking past each other, but it's because of our interpretation of what the God of the Bible is supposed to be. And I feel like you have a more, I guess, modern sense of what the God of the Bible is supposed to be, whereas I'm trying to interpret what the Bible is portraying God at the point in which God is prescribing these laws. So like the God of the Israelites, the God at the time that he was prescribing these things, I do feel like people thought of that God differently than they thought of him much later, either New Testament or even later than that. But still, there's a common thread of this normalization of slavery that exists throughout not only the Bible, but the culture and everything like that. And it exists very much beyond the New Testament. And so like I'm just trying to take it actually in context to what was happening at the time. I don't think that I feel like the Jews were encapsulating their thoughts about how society should be run, and that they are attributing it to God, not that it's actually coming from God. Mm-hmm. So I think that their God is representative of their mindset. And so like their mindset was very normalized to the practice of slavery. So it was either morally gray or good to keep slaves. And that's representative by the Old Testament and how it portrays it. So, I mean, that's how I'm interpreting it. And I understand that you're interpreting it in a different way.
Yeah. Well, we could definitely talk more too about like we could set up a conversation to talk about the concept of God too. That's a big thing that, we could get to the bottom of, because I think that is a big point you just made, is that our concept of God is very different. So
yeah, and I just have to say before you go out, and I'm gonna try to allow people to come in, other people to come in if I can, if they want to like push back on me about any of our conversation. I'll try to keep it to where it's only people that are coming at me, because you're not here to defend yourself or anything. I don't want you to feel attacked or anything. But I do appreciate all of the interaction that we've had in the past, because I've stitched your TikToks on here, and we've communicated in the comments and everything. It's always been very nice. I definitely suggest that if anybody's watching and you don't like my position on this, but you more agree with Joey here, definitely go and follow Joey over there on his TikTok channel and everything. And we don't have too many people here because this is literally the first time I'm going live on TikTok. But I do appreciate you coming on, having the conversation. Yeah. I know that I can be rather big, like a big personality, but I appreciate you sticking it out with me here.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I had a good time. I've enjoyed our interactions. I know we've got kind of snooty a couple times, but that's all in good fun. And I've enjoyed our back and forths.
Awesome. All right. Well, I know that you got to go. And again, thank you so much. And I guess I'll talk to you later. Okay, though, Joey?
Sorry. Yeah, I lost my connection. What did you say?
Oh, I was just saying, thank you so much for coming on. And I guess I'll talk to you later.
Okay. Yeah, I'll talk to you later. Have a good one.
All right. Bye.
Bye.